Let me start with the most common pencil you're probably going to use is known as graphite. If you go to an office store and you just buy the pencil, or if you go to a school supplies store, or when you were in school, the pencils that your teacher gave you, those were graphite pencils. So probably the first pencils you drew with were graphite. So these are the three most common ways you can find, I guess, more artist type graphites. One is just a good old-fashioned graphite pencil in the stick, and these come in many grades. Grade by mean hardness. This is a 6B, so it's fairly soft, yet nice and dark. And we'll talk about the marks you can make later in this lesson as well. This is only the graphite inside, so this is no wood. It's another creative way you can get graphite. It's really fun. I believe it's coated in some kind of plastic. So you can just stick it in your sharpener or sharpen it down, and you can get the same exact point and mark. And this one is one of my favorite tools. It's just the automatic pencil. This is something I picked up at the office store. And you basically load it with these little graphite refillable things. So these are other very common things. You also find these in ordinary office stores. And what I like about these is you don't have to sharpen them. They stay nice and sharp, so they're great for drawing in your sketchbook. So that's a quick overview of various types of graphites. Next, let's talk about charcoal. So obviously charcoal is a little bit more advanced, and these we'll be using to do your finer drawings, your longer studies, your more advanced drawings. Charcoals come in many forms, but the two most common forms are pencil and sticks. So here's sticks. These are three types of sticks that I have in my box. One is this really dark compressed charcoal in this flat kind of stick. So these are pretty common to find in the art store. They get nice and dark and nice and soft, and they make really big, broad strokes, broad marks. These are willows, and they're a little bit harder, and they come in a couple different sizes, but they're typically these long skinny sticks and these big old fat sticks. They're usually, you buy them, they're about this long, so I just break them so they're easier to use. And they basically work the same way as the square stick, just a way to make a big broad mark. And obviously the pencil, and this is sharpened down with a razor blade, you can get the more detailed and finer marks. So again, charcoal is more for creating more full value, full, longer finished drawings, and they're very common to find in the art store. Talk about some other pencils that you may find useful, especially if you're going to be transitioning into life drawing and figure drawing and things, or going to workshops. This is a little bit different. This is a Wolf's carbon, and this one is what's called the Conte Paris. So this one is actually a pastel. These are very common if you're going to be practicing a lot of life drawing, a lot of head drawing. What I like about them is that they have a nice, strong, sturdy wood so that you can sharpen it with a long needle like this, a long point. These are very, very common pencils you'll find at the art store whenever you're ready to begin drawing from life, drawing from reference. These are great for that. And these both are black. This one is earth tone, sort of a reddish umber earth tone. And speaking of color, obviously the colored pencil is another common thing you'll find. I love drawing with colored pencil. This is actually a black colored pencil. It's called the Very Thin, which is basically a hard colored pencil. And it comes in all kinds of different colors, but obviously for drawing, I would recommend black and maybe a gray. This is a colored pencil in earth tone and orange. This is a Prisma color. This is probably the most common colored pencil and arguably one of the highest quality brands, the Prisma color. So these are great. And I like to sharpen them both ends so that I have two sharp points. So again, if you like drawing and you head to the art store, these will be readily available. So I would recommend picking some of these up, especially a dark, a black or a gray. And finally, the last thing we'll talk about is the pastel. So the pastel is a very, very soft mark, and obviously pastels are known for coloring. This is kind of an oily base, so it's very similar to paintings, which is more advanced, but you can have a lot of fun drawing with black pastel. And they typically come in sticks, and this is really, really soft. Again, later you'll see the kind of mark you can make, but this is great for going really dark and making big, bold strokes, big, bold marks. Not so much good for detail, at least a big stick like this, but pastel is great if you want a lot of coverage. So if you want to do big, bold drawings, make big, bold marks, and you want to go dark quickly, pastel is a great choice. And again, these are fairly common, easy to find, especially in stick form like this.
The paper stump is a wonderful tool. This is something they've been using since probably around the Renaissance. This one is made from all recycled paper, which is great. And this is really good for when you're going to blend. But when you use your finger, there's two things. One is that it's not incredibly accurate. The other one is that you're getting oil from your hands onto your drawing surface. The blending stump helps with that. It allows you to create blends and smudges in your tone that's a lot more controlled and precise because you're able to work with the tip here. This is a great tool. You'll have a lot of fun using this. It gives you a lot of versatility in controlling all this material that you're putting down.
All right, so Chris got us all fired up to start making marks. You guys have probably already been drawing while you watch that. I could hardly stand it. We're looking for what type of tools will give us which type of marks. If we're looking at a thinner, sharper kind of line, this would be just a graphite clicky pencil. And you can get a really, really fine, really tight line. If we want to do like a more kind of tonal line or a thicker line, something where we want to fill in a greater space at a time, while something like a Conte can also give us one of these tight lines like this. When you sharpen it, if you want to take it down, you can make the tip also function on the edge. And so by preparing it this way, you can draw both on the tip and just take it and get some tone in really fast. And this helps too when you get into sort of a more painterly method. So there's two tools in one. Another one, if you want to take it down just the side like that, Chris uses pastel. That's just one stroke. A lot of volume in one swipe. You may get to a point where you want to sort of in between like an edge that's a little bit softer. And you can do that with a variety of ways. This is a graphite, but it's not encased in wood. It's sort of similar to that sharpened Conte, where this is all active, this edge here. So if we wanted to get something kind of fuzzy, we might be able to just kind of take it from that tip and feather it out a little bit. This is a generals, and we can do the same thing. When we get into some more of the charcoals, the other cool thing is you got your fingers and you can start finger painting with a lot of these materials. Kind of drag it out a little bit. And the degree of the mark that goes down is going to be relative to the tool you're using and also the type of finish on the paper. If you zoomed in it on a microscope, it would look kind of like a spider web. So what we're doing is laying in pigments into that web. One other note about graphite that's a little different, the particles of graphite are actually kind of like flakes or plates. So if you lay in enough graphite, depending on the paper, it actually starts to have more of a shine to it. And with graphite, you can also start much more slowly and get kind of a slow buildup too. So if you're kind of wanting to be really, really ghosting in, you can also notice the range of hardness or the range of graphite to clay. And the harder pencils are gonna have more clay and the softer pencils are gonna have more graphite. And so that way, if you're just starting off, you may wanna keep it really light and you may not wanna start laying in these thick tones until you're getting really, really confident. But if you know the job you wanna do, there's all kinds of tools available. So I'm sure you guys never make a mistake, but even if you don't, the eraser is a tool in and of itself. And I'm gonna just lay a little bit of tone down. Just taking a Conte, just something to work with. So we can just look at a few different type of eraser marks, and they can be drawing tools as well. So we've got this little guy, that's a kneaded eraser. You can make sweet little dog sculptures in between classes out of these guys. And you can fold it so that you've got kind of a clean spot. If you really want to try to get a little tighter on something, you can kind of pull that end, find a new clean spot, pinch it, and that's going to affect the kind of mark you can lift out. That'll help lift it out a little bit this way. This guy, more just of a average white kind of plasticky eraser. This guy's already kind of got these hard edges. See how it works on graphite over here. And this one's probably more reminiscent of the kind you used in school growing up. It doesn't quite have the versatility of this one that you can sculpt does, this kneaded eraser. So that's this guy versus this guy. And then, this is sweet, I just swiped it out of Chris's box. This is an eraser pencil, literally encased in wood. This looks like Faber-Castell. And let's just play with this here. So let's take this guy over this tone. So it's lifting it out as well. If we look over here, just on the graphite. So look at that, I mean, this is really fine. You can sharpen this to a point. So if you're doing an exercise where you want to do some really tight rendering or careful work, this thing would be awesome. Take that razor just like you would sharpen another pencil. So we've done a really quick here intro to some different types of marks made with pencils and with erasers. So Chris is going to come in here and tell you a little about pens and markers.
Really, pens and markers come in two basic forms. They're either going to be some kind of ball point, like this on the right, or a felt tip, like this over here on the left. Little tiny felt tip. So let's start with a ballpoint. Now, my favorite pen in the universe is the ordinary Bic office ballpoint. Bic is a very, very common pen. Just a nice ordinary ballpoint pen, makes a beautiful, pretty line. Very similar effect to like a drawing pencil. And they come in different sizes and forms. This is an old school one here. You can also get a ballpoint with what's called gel ink. This is a little bit of a gel pen, a little bit of a darker ink. And these are all at the office store. You can find them at our store too, but you can just find them at any old school supply or office store. Very common, very easy to find. You can even get them for free. That's what I love about them. So ordinary ballpoint pen is great for drawing, great for practice. Other common pen you'll find are the felt tips. So these are two different brands. Really, really nice, tight, precise line. I'll show you what that looks like. Really tight line. And this is a Sakura Micron brand, very common brand, also a felt tip. More the artsy kind of most art stores should be able to get. And the advantage of felt versus ballpoint is that felt will almost always dry right away. A gel or a ballpoint may not dry too quickly, but felt tips will dry almost instantly as soon as they touch your papers. So they're great for making nice permanent lines. And speaking of permanent, let's get into the markers. So probably my favorite marker in the universe is the Sharpie, AKA the black permanent marker. AKA you can find it anywhere in the universe. Look at that bad boy. And now Sharpies come in different sizes and shapes. So this is the most common marker, and this is like the pen, it's a felt tip pen, so it dries instantly. Nice and dark and rich mark. This is a Sharpie that has two sides. These are fairly common now. And you can also get them in this big boy size with a big fat wedge. So great for making bigger strokes, getting more coverage. So I really love the Sharpie because it's nice and dark, it's inexpensive, and very, very easy to find. And finally, the last type of marker that you may be using, you may enjoy, are the art markers. So this is Prismacolor brand. They also make really nice colored pencils and things, but their markers are excellent. And there are several different brands you may find, but they typically will be in the same style, kind of this big, fat looking body with two tips. This one has a fine tip, and this one has a big fat head, a wedge tip's what it's called. So you can get a variety of different marks. These come in different colors, but for drawing, I love gray. This one's a 40% right in the middle. It's about a mid-tone gray. And of course, black. Black all day long, because black gives you a nice, crispy, dark mark, get a lot of coverage. So these are great. So these actually have beautiful tones. That's the advantage of these guys versus the Sharpie, is that you can get a whole range of tones, and it's a really nice, clean pigment. So think of it as Sharpie is more of like a crude sketching tool. And if you really want to do renderings, there's many ways to do beautiful renderings with Prismacolor markers or other types of art markers you may find at your local art store. Okay, so that was a quick look at various pens that you can use and enjoy when you're drawing. Now let's take a look at some papers and various papers and things you can use as well when you're doing your drawings.
All right, let's look at some common papers and ones that we would recommend using at New Masters Academy. So starting on the end here, this is a really smooth newsprint. And the newsprint is gonna be great for sketching and studying. It's not gonna be great for anything you wanna keep. Newsprint can actually start to deteriorate within like 2 or 3 years. Next to that is a bond paper, and the bond paper is a blend. It's gonna be a mix of the wood and the cotton, and bond papers are common. Those are also seen in writing and printing, the stuff you stick in your copier, and they have varying degrees of quality, but they are gonna last longer than the newsprint. So if you're a student wanting to do sketches and you're worried about using newsprint because you think, I might actually like this, I might wanna keep it, then you might consider stepping up to a bond or a blended paper. The tracing papers are great. Those actually are non-aging. They have a really nice smooth surface for doing studies on. This is 66% cotton rag. This is the Canson paper. This also comes in a nice tone. So that's another option. If you want to have maybe a dark value and maybe you have like a white Conte crayon, you can find a paper in a middle value and then use your utensils for the darkest darks and the lightest lights and let that be the mid-range. You can also find paper with different tints and color. This is also an example of a laid pattern, and the laid refers to the wire screen, which gives it a texture. Here we have the Bristol from Strathmore, and this starts to get a little bit thicker. And the thicker the paper, the more forgiving it's gonna be, the more you'll be able to get your eraser in there, and the more redos you're gonna get. This is a vellum finish, but there's a couple different finishes with Bristol. And then finally at the end here, this is 100% cotton, and it's handmade. And if you look at the edge here, it's a little bit rough because it's a deckled edge. And these are some of the highest quality, most archival papers that are around. So you can really experiment. You'll find if you're using something like graphite, you're probably gonna want a smoother surface. If you're using a charcoal or Conte, you do want a little bit of texture. And if you're using a pastel, you probably really want a lot of texture in your paper.
So Heather has given you lots of different options for paper. To keep things simple, we'll recommend 2 different papers. The first one is smooth newsprint. This is ideal for sketching, for practice work. It works really good with charcoal pencil especially, as well as pastel pencil. This newsprint is a smooth surface, which is ideal, although it's a little bit trickier to find. It is not archival. Over time it will yellow. However, it's a really nice surface to draw on. You'll notice that it has a slightly gray color. It's not pure white, but it's a really nice surface to draw on, especially for practice sketches or for things that you don't care too much about yellowing or falling apart over time. The second option is this Canson sketch pad. This is a lightweight sketch paper. It has a little bit more texture, a little bit of tooth to really hold your pencil marks, and it is a nice bright white surface, which means that you can achieve a full range of value more easily than you can on the newsprint. Also, this is an acid-free archival surface, so it won't yellow over time. So now you have an idea of what papers to use for your assignments and for your drawing practice. Now, I have to say the newsprint is a really great surface, especially for charcoal drawing. However, it can be hard to find, particularly the smooth surface. Now, ideally, whatever paper that you're using for your assignments, for practice, should ideally be easy to find and cheap. So if you can't find newsprint where you are, go with whatever paper is readily available that is not too expensive, so that you are free to do as much drawing as possible.
All right, now we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects is the sketchbook. Sketchbooks come in many different forms, many different sizes.
Let's start with probably one of the most common ones. This is just a hardbound little mini black book here. And this is great. Keep some notes in it, do some little thumbnails.
Yeah, definitely. I see those everywhere, and they come in all different sizes as well, but the hardbound is very common. I personally like the spiral bound. It's just like the hardbound, same type of material on the outside. But what I like is that you can lay it flat. And this is great for photographing and scanning. So if you want to archive your work. If you don't want to get a pre-made sketchbook, you can get creative. You can have your own made, get some paper together and have it bound.
The hardbound books can feel really precious. They're permanent, right? You don't want to X-Acto knife out a page in here. There's some other great ways to be more creative. One step up from the cocktail napkin at the bar, the Post-it note. These are great. These are already like a frame. And you can sit there and you can whip through them. You can brainstorm, you can do thumbnails. If you like them, you can stick them up on the wall when you're done. These are a great way to start idea generation, or maybe composing in the field if you're plein air, or you don't want to have to carry around a bunch of stuff. Another way to kind of free things up, be a little more creative with it, is just to get a clipboard and any kind of loose, cheap paper that you want.
If you want to take it a step up, you can also get specialty papers. One of the favorite ways I like to go is with the tone paper sketchbook. This is a spiral bound tone paper. This one is in a gray tone, and they come in all different shades. And what I like about tone paper, obviously, is you have the option to go black and also add white. So that's great about tone paper. And you can also, if you want to get into water media, you can get a watercolor sketchbook. And obviously this has a little bit thicker paper. So if you want to experiment with watercolor like this, or if you're just beginning drawing, you can go with inks and black and white watercolor washes as well. This is more than just drawing for me. This is a way of life. These are my personal sketchbooks, and notice they're full, son. What's up? Yeah, this has got to be a part of your life. And that's one of the ways that you can get the most out of your practice time is to bring your sketchbook.
So if you're a serious student, you know, Chris, I've heard that when you're trying to work in something like entertainment, they'll ask you, they'll look through your sketchbook. Is that true?
Oh, 100%. In fact, many entertainment studios, animation, video games, even film, advertising, entertainment work. When you come to the interview, you better make sure your sketchbook is packed. You better make sure it's full, because that's how they judge whether you're serious, whether you're committed.
Right.
So definitely, if you're leaning towards that career path, you definitely want to carry your sketchbook with you.
All right, so we've covered the basic materials to get started. And now let's talk about the furniture you need to set up a studio space. Let's take a look at some of the materials you might want to have on hand for pencil sharpening. There are a couple different types of razor blades you could get. I like to get these single edge blades. They're super cheap if you get them in a big box from the hardware store. And they do dull pretty fast, so it's nice to have them on hand. If you end up painting down the road, you can slip them into a holder and use them to clean your palette as well. Here's one type of sanding pad. These can rip off as little sheets. I don't remember the last time I had to rip one off. They last a really long time. So this is a sanding pad that's specially made for artists. This is one of my personal faves. It is a cheap sanding block from the hardware store. It's active on the edges and on the broad sides. And some people will choose not to use every side so that their hands don't get gross. Also, it's nice to have some Ziploc bags to store these in, especially if you're carrying them anywhere with you. Okay, this is a very sad thing. This happens a lot. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, a pencil hits the dust and you lose the tip. We hope it only broke here. Sometimes it breaks further down the barrel. So we take a little bit of a risk when we sharpen it again and hope it's not broken anywhere further down the shaft. Let's go ahead and take a blade and see if we get lucky. With this, we're always going to be cutting away from ourselves because we're going to be cutting sort of parallel with the long axis of the pencil. And that's not just for safety. That's because our aim is to create a long taper in the pencil. I'm going to hold the blade this way in my right hand because I am right-handed, and the pencil in my left. I'm going to have this as parallel as they can be. I'm going to think about following through this way and not putting a great deal of pressure. So with this thumb, I'm going to start to get a little bit of steam and just come through. We're going to rotate slowly and begin to make our way around. This is a great opportunity to start to kind of tune in, become present, put on a good soundtrack, get in the mood. You may even want to do a bunch of pencils at once. I had a great teacher who always said that whenever you were done drawing for the day, to sharpen your pencil so it was ready to go again the next time you wanted to study. If it already had a little bit of a start to it, if the lead was already a little bit tapered, I might spend a little longer on the wood. But right now it has a little more support around it. And if it's fragile in here, this might increase our odds that we actually get it sharpened if I can do some of this work on the fragile tip while it still has wood around it to help support it. Some people like to take the razor and where they use the middle maybe for the wood, they'll flip it to this other grip and use a little bit of an edge that's still really sharp, reserved for just the tip here. I'm taking down about as much, probably like 1-to-1 ratio. I want to expose the wood and the active conte. The reason for that is so I can make really great use of this pencil I'll have more than one tool where I, just have the tip active. I'll be able to toggle back and forth between a little bit of a line stroke to a little bit of a broader, to even twist it in my hand and in one stroke go from a thin to a thick. And if I wanted to lay in tone, it's really great to have that nice graphite or conte exposed so you can just lay in a nice even tone. And now that we have that, I'll start to slide down a little bit more. The closer I get to getting this done, the more important it is to make sure to be parallel. You'll find there's a little bit of glue or an adhesive between the wood layer and the conte. And so you just want to carefully remove that. And once I like how much conte is exposed, I'm actually going to switch. I prefer to do the finishing with sandpaper. All right, cool. So we're getting there. We're getting warm. Take it down a little here. Careful, careful. All right. Okay, I'm gonna put the blade down. You can see we've got almost a nice 1-to-1 ratio here. And now I wanna finish it off into a point. Let's start with the sanding pad. And then I'm gonna move to the sanding block. One of my buddies told me the key is to turn slowly, and I think he's right about that. As you get closer to a finish, you wanna slow your rotation down. I might go a little aggressive in the beginning. And I'm holding it again fairly flat, fairly parallel to the pad. I'm not getting a real harsh angle here, keeping it pretty flat. I found if you have black trash bags, it's really hard to see. If you check your pencil to see how you're doing, it's hard to see it against that. So you might want to find like a light thing to, lift it up against to check. The nice thing is once you've got it started, it might dull from drawing. It doesn't take as long to tune it as it does to start it. Let's go ahead, let's try switching to the pad, see how that goes. A little check here. Getting closer. At this point, I kind of just look for any sharp angles. If it looks faceted, like a gem, we want it to look smooth, like a really smooth cone. All right, guys, I think we saved this one. So you can see now we've got a nice long taper. We have about as much lead showing as the wood approximately. And you can imagine that if it's nice and smooth, you can rock it down on the paper from tip to nearly parallel with the paper, and you can find a variety of any mark in between. Number 1, writing style. So this is how you would hold a pencil in grade school when you're learning to write your name. You're probably pretty familiar with how this feels, and you might even guess some of the pros and cons with it. We discussed before how it is important to think of drawing from your shoulder, from using more of your whole body, and how it isn't an advantage a lot of times to draw from your wrist. So with this, if we step to the paper here, we find it does tend to lead us to that temptation to draw with our wrist. And that may not be bad if we're ready for some really fine finishing moves, getting up on the tip, getting that last little darkest dark in a pupil. This might actually even be a decent way to approach like sketchbooking, for instance, or when you're holding something like a ballpoint pen where the tip is the only active area on the implement. The con is it's a little bit limiting and it's a little bit harder to draw from the shoulder to get big shapes or to see the big picture. All right, number 2, the underhand. So this is a grip where we have the pads of our fingers below and the thumb on the top. You'll notice we can get right up towards the tip or move back a little bit. When we lay our hand down, we'll find we can actually fulcrum or rest a few different ways. So one fulcrum is resting the fingers against the page, while some artists might like to kind of cantilever up on the back of the nails. Might be kind of slick and easy to slide that way. And it lifts you up a little bit more, so you have this angle which gets you more towards the tip. And maybe if you want to be more parallel, you could try resting your fingers. So play with both. Some advantages to the underhand grip are you can really make the most out of this tool. For instruments that have this nice long edge, you can use the whole active area. You can drop whole planes in with tone. And in the same stroke, you can start on the tip and end with the broadside. Also, this starts to get you back a little further from the page, starts to help you see the bigger picture. Third way to hold your pencil, sort of a subtle variation on the second way. The underhand grip slid to the edge becomes the end grip. Really frees you up from the shoulder. You can step way back and see the whole picture in context, the whole big relationship. Pros, you feel like Harry Potter. You get a really nice look at the whole page. Tunnel vision is one of those things you want to check yourself against, and this is going to really help you because this is great for when you're kind of looking to lay something in or see how it looks on the whole page. It's also nice if you kind of want to ghost something in really lightly. You're in your shoulder. You can make big sweeping strokes, can find those rhythms. Also, this is a lot like painting. And so not only is it really fun, but again, if you're into painting, you're interested in pursuing it down the road, this is really great transition. You can go back and forth with a lot of ease. Because there is no fulcrum here, there are, some cons. It's a little harder to control the pressure. It's definitely probably not the finishing move, last little detail in the eye. Probably not great for rendering like the other grips could have been used for. This one also, the longer you stay in your shoulder without resting against the paper, you might start to fatigue a little bit in your shoulder. The other nice thing about having the grip on the end is you may like to use it to check a plumb line. Same thing with the paintbrush. They're nice and long for a reason. They actually can work as measuring tools.
Whenever I get into something, I like to really dive deep into it. I get really obsessed with it. And when I found New Masters, it was just like this treasure trove with just this amazing amount of information, the production, the instructors. It was just like the perfect thing.
I had been drawing since I was very little. I felt like my lack of training was holding me back. I knew deep down that I didn't have the fundamentals. So it's when I decided to really start studying hard that I joined.
I've been working as an artist for over 15 years. I had a big lack of knowledge and I thought, okay, that's it. I can run from it. I need to learn the foundation, right? That was a game changer for me.
I work full time. I have a family. I have kids. I have dogs. I have other obligations. Sometimes I can only draw maybe 4 hours a week, if that. I've still seen sizable improvement every single week. I've just improved as an artist.
For me, New Masters Academy works a lot better than a traditional art school. Both interactive feedback and NMA critics have been encouraging. They always found something that I could improve.
Every single course taught me something very special. Even the first weeks with Renee, they give you the basic knowledge, which is geometric forms, perspective, the laws of light. And that's amazing because it empowers you from the beginning.
Every instructor is amazing. Captain Balkowski, you have Charles Hugh, Patrick Jones, Joshua, the founder of New Masters, and the fact that he interacts with students so often, talking to people directly, you won't find that in any other organization.
Really convinced now that studying the fundamentals is essential to really make the art I want to make.
I'm so grateful for them to exist.
So Heather showed us some techniques, some ways of measuring our subjects so that we can see them accurately. I'm going to show you a little bit of how to put all of those different techniques into a process so that you can look at household objects, just ordinary things that you'll have around your home, and use these different measuring techniques in order to draw them accurately. Now, before I even just dive into that, I want to say a little bit more about measuring in drawing and what it means and why we need to do it. I think a lot of students sometimes have a misconception, or sometimes they'll even tell me, well, I avoid measuring because measuring makes my drawing stiff. And it certainly can, but I think it's very important to understand that we're not just measuring for accuracy, we're not just measuring to make everything very perfect and very representational of exactly what we're seeing when we're observing our subject. We're also measuring in order to understand our subject, in order to understand what our subject actually looks like. And sometimes, it's very easy to think that we know what it looks like, but to basically be tricked. We're tricked all the time by our eyes. We're not naturally good observers, right? If we were naturally good observers of what the world really looked like, then you wouldn't need to study so hard in order to draw well, right? So one thing that actually helps us to observe and helps us to understand what our subject really looks like are these measuring techniques, okay? So I just really want to emphasize that. Now, the other thing that I wanted to say is that measuring is also about relationships, okay? We're noticing relationships within our subject, relationships of height to width, relationships of different angles and how they might have a symmetry or asymmetry, as the case may be. All those relationships are very, very important to consider. Drawing is about relationships. Everything in the drawing, every mark you make, every line, every value, every edge, hue change, whatever, they all have to relate to one another properly. So one way that we begin to understand that and to put that idea into practice is by measuring and looking very consciously for relationships within our subject. So let's try this ourselves. I have a bottle of liquid here. It's an oil painting medium. So for me, this is an everyday object. But if you have something similar to this, this is an interesting object because unlike a lot of other common man-made household objects that you may have laying around, this one is actually asymmetrical. This side over here on the left for me is sort of bows outward, while this side here is more straight and it has this little detail here, this sort of beveled edge. So it's an interesting object because it's actually not perfectly symmetrical, and that gives me some opportunities to show you how to employ the different measuring techniques that Heather showed you. All right, so how do we begin looking at this thing? How do we begin actually observing this object and then putting something down on the paper that represents it? So the first proportional relationship that I'm going to look for on this liquid bottle is the overall width compared to the overall height, okay? So the width is the shorter dimension, so I'm gonna start with that. I'm gonna look for a measurement for the width and then just compare that to the height. In other words, how many widths can I line up along the height, all right? So just using my pen here, I'm gonna put the top of my pen, line that up with the left edge of the bottle, and then I'm gonna move my thumb so that my thumbnail is lined up with the right edge of the bottle so that that captures the width. Just turn that vertical. And then how many widths can I line up along the height? And I'm doing this several times, you'll notice. In fact, I'll even just do it one more time, starting from measuring the width. Okay, there's the width, turn it vertical, compare. it's about 2. Okay, so in other words, in this case, the height is roughly twice the width. Now I did that several times. I measured that more than once just to really make sure. The thing is that measuring with a pen or a pencil or a skewer or a knitting needle or whatever you have, it's not a precision instrument, okay? We're not measuring like centimeters or inches or whatever. We're measuring relationships. So on this bottle, the height is 2 times the width. So that's the first thing I just need to concern myself with, is thinking about that proportional relationship. If you're thinking of it in proportions that way, as a ratio, then you can draw this bottle as big as you want. You can draw it like a little miniature in a sketchbook, teeny tiny, or you could draw it the size of a garage door, and the proportions will always be correct because you're thinking of them in terms of ratio. You can shrink that up, shrink it back down. The relationships will stay the same. So usually what I do, I'll start with the longer dimension on the paper, and I'll make that kind of arbitrary. Let's just decide this is the top, that's going to be the bottom, something like that. That height there, notice I didn't measure anything at all. I just decided that's a top, that's a bottom. Okay, that can be arbitrary, right? Now, when I put in the width, when I decide where do I want the width to go, I have to make the width correct in relationship to this distance, this height that I just established on my paper. So I'll find maybe halfway between those 2 points. Double check that. I just guessed. Oh, I guessed pretty good, I guess. So just take that 1/2 of the height and then put that horizontal, and that should be the width. There you go. So the widest point of the bottle is down here at the bottom. That's why I put those lines down here, but we can just take this whole thing and just make this a rectangle, okay? Just give yourself a rectangle, and the dimensions of that rectangle are just the height to width ratio of your object that you're drawing, all right? And then you can imagine, basically, the way that we're going to sort of go about this, essentially, is to imagine carving this bottle out of a block of wood. So here's your block of wood, and now at some point we're going to have to start chopping off some chunks of the wood to start to gradually whittle into these more specific shapes. Before I do that, though, I'm going to try to find the middle. Where is the center on my object? I have a center here. Okay, that's halfway from top to bottom. I can guess again where's halfway from side to side. That looks about right. Just double check. Could probably move that over just a wee smidge. Okay. That's better. All right, so that would be middle on my drawing. Now I need to find middle on my bottle. I know from measuring before, if I compare width to height, that it should be right about the top of this label that's wrapping around the bottle. That's about halfway from my perspective. In fact, maybe it's actually slightly below that. So I can maybe even make a little mark here, just a little indication to remind myself that the top of the label there is just slightly above the halfway point. And that's probably going to be true if I look horizontally as well. If I measure a horizontal, look for a horizontal halfway point. Because this bottle is asymmetrical, that label is not going to be perfectly centered on the bottle. It's actually going to kind of slope up and then peak up here, actually to the right of middle. So I'm guessing a little bit as to where that's going to go. But in drawing a lot, you have to guess. In fact, I encourage that when it comes to measuring. Often I think you learn better, you learn to make better observations, more accurate observations by just giving it your best guess first. Just, go based on just sort of eyeballing it first and then double check yourself by measuring. And often that's a better way to go about it. Okay, but now that I have center kind of figured out, I have center on my drawing and I have an idea of where center should go on my bottle here. And if you're drawing something like this from life, you can maybe even give yourself a little mark so that you know where center is. Don't do that on a live model that you're drawing, but on a bottle with a paper label, I don't think it's too big of a deal. Okay, now I'm going to find a yardstick, just something that I can easily see very clearly, that I can sort of latch onto to find more relationships and more comparisons within this object. And that's going to be different depending on what you're looking at. It really depends on what you're drawing. So I can't just tell you, oh, always use this or always use that. It's really going to depend on your particular subject that you're observing, okay? If you're drawing from the model, for instance, a very common sort of yardstick to use is the head height, right? How many heads tall is the figure? How many heads down to the knee, or how many heads down to the navel, or whatever. So that's a very common yardstick when you're drawing from the figure. If you're drawing still life objects though, each one is maybe going to be a little bit different. So in this case, I have a very obvious, I think, yardstick, something that I can easily latch onto, which is the height of this black cap on top. So if I look at that cap, I can see it very clearly. I can see a top edge and a bottom edge, and I can grab onto that measurement and compare it to the overall height of the bottle to find some more observations, some more relationships about this subject. Okay, so I'm going to, again, use my pen to measure my yardstick, which is the black cap on this bottle, and then I'll compare how many heights of those cap can I line up along the whole length, or the whole height, rather, of the bottle. So taking the clicky part of my pen and lining it up with the top edge of that cap. I always hold my wrist or my elbow to keep my hand from shaking. And then I'm just going to line up my thumbnail with the bottom edge of that cap. So that's my yardstick, and then I'm just going to compare. And it seems like it's going to be about 1/4 of the height. Yeah, it's like pretty much exactly, because it's two cap heights down to the middle. So that's really easy. Things don't always work out nicely like that. So if I go basically from middle to top and then just divide that in half, and again, just guess to begin with. That's pretty close. It should be a little higher up, I think. That's about right. So this will be the overall height of the cap. Now, I'm just being really loosey-goosey with this line here because I'm not totally sure where exactly that cap is going to be centered along this horizontal space, especially since this bottle is asymmetrical, right? So I have to think about that. So if I look at from the middle of the bottle up, so now I'm using a plumb line basically. I know roughly where middle is on the overall object. So if I take my pen just vertically, as vertical as I can get it anyway, and line it up with that point, then I can sort of see that relationship of where does center of the bottle line up with center on the cap, since the cap is actually off center because the bottle is asymmetrical. And yeah, I'm just going to eyeball it. It's actually not that far off of center. So if I extend that middle line up a little bit, the left side of the cap probably starts around here, I would just guess. But let's also look at the width. Let's also look at the width of the cap. And I'll maybe compare that to the overall width of the bottle at the widest point. So it's a little over, yeah, it would be 2 1/4 cap widths. So something like that. Yeah, so that would be about the width of that cap. So I'd put that about here. And I think that's about right. That looks about right to my eye. I'm going to compare center again. Center, imagine a perfectly vertical line going down from center, and then how does the cap itself relate to that vertical line? It could maybe scooch over just a little tiny bit. So again, noticing relationships, noticing these overall comparisons of the overall bottle. You're not measuring to just draw one part and then another part and another part and another part. You're trying to wrap your arms around the whole thing and how the whole thing relates together as a whole. Okay, I'm going to look for a couple of angles now. I would like to start to find the angle of the left side of the bottle as it sort of slopes up here. Now this is a little bit tricky because obviously looking at the bottle, this contour here is very curved, right? It's a very organic, smooth, flowing curve. It's a cool shape, very interesting. But for us, it's very difficult to measure a curve, right? Curves are they're hard. Curves are difficult. So instead of visualizing that right now as a curve, which is hard to measure, difficult to draw, you have to be very, very, very precise in order to get that right in one fell swoop. Instead of doing that, I'm just going to imagine that that curve has little facets, almost like a gemstone that would be cut into planes so it can sparkle, right? So, and that's usually what I do with stuff like this, especially when you're painting, and in oil paint, it's hard to draw a curve linearly. Instead of trying to go right for that curve, I'll try to break it up into little facets, little straight lines. And then these are all things that you can measure, right? This curve, how do you measure that? It's difficult. But if you have just a flat line that you're, or a flat plane that you're imagining, that you're sort of visualizing in space and imagining in your mind, then you can line up your pen with that. You can measure that angle, capture that, and then compare it back to your drawing, right? So if you picture those curves as having theoretical flat edges, flat planes, it makes it a lot easier to measure it and figure out how to approximate that on your paper. And then as you continue the process of developing the drawing, over time, you'll smooth out that curve into something that's more organic and more true to what we're seeing in the subject. But for right now, I'm going to try to picture that curve, this curve here, as having straight edges. So looking down at the bottom, okay. Now this is important to actually measure the edge of that bottle. Imagine a flat plane there. What is the angle of that flat plane? But then just try to draw it without copying anything first, right? I measure that angle with my pen. I look at the angle. I sort of memorize what that looks like. Think about that for a second, but then I'm just going to try to draw that based on my memory and also my observation of this thing in front of me. And then I'll double check, okay? So I guessed, now I'm checking. Compare that angle, freeze my hand. Okay, that looks good, all right. And just continue all the way up, inching up along that curve as it sort of moves in space. What does that angle look like? Maybe something like that. Let's double check it. So I'm lining up my pen so that it matches the angle that I'm seeing on the edge of that bottle. And then I'm comparing that to the drawing. When you're measuring angles, you don't have to worry too much about bending your arm or whatever. It doesn't matter. The angle's always going to be the same. It's not like when you're measuring proportions. If you're measuring proportions and you're comparing, like, how does the width compare to the height, or how many cap heights can I fit along the whole height of the bottle? If you're doing proportional measuring like that, you really want to keep your arm out straight, elbow locked, and then hold your elbow or hold your wrist so that you don't move around a bunch. But if you're measuring angles, you can be a little bit more relaxed because the angle doesn't change. Whether it's here or here, it's going to be the same angle. So you can be a little bit more, loosey-goosey. Not loosey-goosey, I mean, take your time and be careful, but you don't need to worry about keeping your arm locked out straight. Okay, so something like that. Do another one, angles in just slightly more. And then it sort of goes up this way. And as I draw, I can start to curve that out a little bit into the more sort of organic shape that it really has. But I can be a bit more confident that that shape is reasonably accurate because I did all that measuring first. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. This contour is also sort of interesting because we have this almost like a cutout here, this beveled thing here. But that sort of makes it easier to measure angles actually because this is basically a flat plane. I could imagine taking this point here and this point here and connecting those, and that would be another angle. So you don't just have to measure angles that are literal angles that appear on your subject. You can also measure made-up angles. Any two points on your subject that you can connect with a line, you can measure the angle of that line and compare that to your drawing, okay? So it doesn't have to be a literal line that you see or a literal contour, a literal angle that is really there. Any 2 points you can connect with an imaginary line and measure the angle of that line. So that's what I'm going to do here. You have sort of a corner sticking out here and another little corner sticking out here. Imagine in your mind that there's an angle connecting those two. What is the angle of that line? And then go on from there. And then here's another literal angle that we can also measure. So I'm just going to do that. So line up your pen with that contour, sort of memorize what it looks like. Try to remember in your mind. And then double check it. So give it your best guess first. Just by observing. I was a little off that time. And then double check it and then go on from there. So. And important to remember that this is really not like a precision kind of thing. I mean, even as I'm sitting here, I'm moving around slightly, my paper moves around a little bit. My perspective on the object will change slightly, each time I measure. I'm breathing, all of this stuff. And so I think it is also important to remember that this is a very different experience drawing something from life in front of you and trying to observe it and measure it. It's a very different experience than if you're just looking at a photograph or something that is always going to look the same no matter what. So here we're in 3 dimensions, at least I'm in 3 dimensions. Things can move around. You're certainly going to move around. Your vantage point changes, and that's part of the process. But it's something that also teaches you a lot about how do things really look in space, because you're not viewing a flat thing. You're seeing something that really exists in the real world. Okay, I wanted to point out also this little angle here where this bevel occurs. Something else I would like to notice: this point here, how does that relate to the middle? And it's almost at the middle, so I may have made it too low. Because if I go, actually the middle is higher. So I'm just putting my pen as close to horizontal as I can, and I'm seeing how does this point here align with middle here? And middle is still a little bit higher. I guess that's okay. I'm just gonna go with it. Sometimes it's hard to tell how accurate things are when you don't have enough context put in. So I do encourage you, if this is a new concept for you, if this is stuff that you haven't really had to work on before, Don't get too caught up on thinking, oh, it doesn't look right, it doesn't look right in the first few steps when you're drawing. It's not going to look right. You don't have enough context in order to really see what you're doing. So it does take a certain critical mass of drawing, of just going through the motions and getting things on the paper in order to really be able to respond to what you've done, right? You can't make a correction when you don't have anything on the paper. So make some marks, do your best to measure, take your time, but also don't be afraid to just try something and see what happens, because you simply can't tell that much unless you have something on the paper to look at and to correct. Okay, I think now what I'm going to do, now that I have this overall contour here, I'm going to sort of sketch in the shape of the label, and I'm not really going to measure, because now that I have the overall contour of the bottle in, I kind of don't really need to. I can look at the edge of this label, just imagine little points all along the label here, and compare that to the shape of this contour down here, and then look at the distance between them, okay? And at each point along this label, that distance changes just ever so slightly. And so if I really, really notice that, and as I sketch along the contour of that label, I can push and pull it in different directions in order to capture the right relationship for how it is wrapping around that form and how it is relating to that outside edge. And I'm still drawing, you'll notice, in little short strokes. And when I get to this point over here, I'm trying to think about how that paper label is wrapping around the form, the same way that if you were to take a cylinder, something like that, and draw a line all the way around it, it would wrap around like that. It wouldn't just be a flat line, nope, it would curve back and around, curve around towards us and then bend back around the other way. So wrapping that label around the form. Same thing down here, looking at the shape of this bottom edge of the bottle here. The label has rounded corners, not that that's that big of a deal, but just noticing. So that label wraps around that whole form, something like that. Okay. I'm just going to jump back up to this little beveled shape over here because I really didn't finish this thought. I probably should think about this a bit more before jumping into the label and everything. But there's an interesting kind of a plane change happening here. We have this shape coming out this way, and then this actually angles in and we have some overlapping forms. So I'm going to measure the angle of this plane right here, just using my pen. What is that angle? And sometimes you have to just simplify or edit a little bit of what you see. Because from my position, it's kind of hard to see an angle there. It's this bottle's a little dirty. Nothing wrong with that. It's well-loved art material. That makes us happy. But it means that I have a hard time seeing exactly where is this edge, where is this plane. So do your best, basically. There's something like a line there, something like an edge or a corner or a plane that I can line up my pencil with, my pen with, and then compare to my drawing. And that's enough to get me started. It looks something like that. Just double check to make sure. That looks pretty good. Again, you can't correct something, you can't problem solve if you don't have anything on the paper. So find something to measure, even if it's a little bit vague to you. Preferably, you should be measuring points on your subject that you can see very easily. But sometimes you just can't. So do your best and then get it on the paper, and then you can figure out where to go from there. But it's hard to make a correction if you don't have anything on the paper. Okay, so there's that. And then this shape here overlaps this plane here that comes down this way. So I'll measure that angle as well. I'm looking at this kind of flat plane here. Let's measure that angle. And that looks like it would come out this way. I'm going to double check that. Nope. And sometimes your guess is wrong. That's okay. But the more that you actually do this, the more that you make an observation from your subject, measure an angle, look at a proportion, make a guess. What's the height to width ratio? How many caps tall is that? Give it your best guess first. I think it's 3.5 caps tall, something like that. Make that guess, maybe even put it on the paper, and then double check it. The more you do that, it's like running it's like making a hypothesis and then running an experiment. The more you do that, the more you learn, the better your guesses become, right? So this is part of how you really learn how to see, how you learn to observe actually very well, right? It's really hard to assess for yourself if you're seeing things accurately, if you're making good observations, if you don't have anything to check them with, right? So by measuring and learning how to do this whole process, you're teaching yourself how to be a better observer, okay? That's why it matters, right? So I think that's pretty good. We're just gonna go with that. And then this has a straight edge there that goes down like that. And then we see a little bit of this plane here. I'll just make a little tiny edge there so that we sort of understand that there's a plane change there. And if I make this line here a little bit darker, we'll get a feeling of that overlapping form. Okay, something like that. Okay, I'm going to jump back up to the cap because I have some overall proportions for the cap. I basically did for the cap what I did for the overall bottle, which is I found the height, I found the width, and then I just made a rectangle. But the cap doesn't actually look like that. So from my perspective, I'm looking down slightly on the cap, so I see a little bit of this top plane. And then the bottom edge is actually rounding down away from me since this is slightly below my eye line. So I need to, and I'll just sort of guess, a lot of guessing and drawing, but I'll draw basically this top plane, this ellipse at the top of the cap, and then the side plane, and then this bottom edge here for the bottom edge of that cap. So the top plane I think would be, it's a little bit less than halfway of the entire height. That's my guess anyway. I shall check that. This is a very small form. So the smaller the object is, or the smaller the forms are that you're trying to measure, the more tricky it becomes, right? So I can measure that. I can figure out that. I think my guess here is going to be, pretty accurate. I might make this just a little bit wider. That would be the top plane of the cap. But it becomes more difficult basically to measure it because it's smaller. But it doesn't matter. I'm just going to draw in a top plane for that cap. Something like that. And then edges coming down here. And then the bottom edge of that cap, something like that. I may have made this distance too wide, possibly. I'll probably just go with it, but I think I maybe need to curve this out down a bit more. So again, even when you're drawing one little part, like the cap, for example, you still have to think about all of the other things happening on the form as well. Not just how does the cap look, but also how does the form overall look? How does the cap relate back to that so that it all makes sense together? Now, another thing I could do just to double check some things, if I, again, look for some imaginary points, I can look for an imaginary point just on the very edge of the cap here and compare that maybe down to this point here, someplace on the side of the bottle. What is that angle? So 2 points, any 2 points you can connect with a line, compare. I probably could have brought out this edge just a little bit wider. Let me try that one more time. Oh, actually it's pretty close. Okay, second time I measured it, it looks better. Yeah, I think it's actually pretty good. But again, that's why you double check things, and that's why you need something on your paper in order to double check, right? You can't really tell if that relationship here, basically from this point here on the cap, imaginary line, down to this point here on the bottle, does that really look like on the object? You can't tell if this relationship is correct unless you have it in your drawing already, right? So get something down on the paper, and then you can assess it. You can respond to it. And then besides that, I think that's just about it for this bottle of liquid. And there's a little measuring process for you. So just to recap, look for an overall height to width ratio. Usually I find it's easier to take the shorter dimension and compare it to the longer dimension, but that also maybe depends on you and depends on the subject that you're looking at. So once you find that overall height to width ratio, draw a rectangle with the same proportional relationship on your paper, find middle on that rectangle, find middle on your subject, and make sure that you really understand where both of those things are. And then from there, most of the time I would suggest, especially if you have a little bit more of a complicated subject that you're looking at, try to find a yardstick on that subject. Some kind of measuring tool that is easy to see, easy for you to measure, that you can look for more relationships, more proportional relationships with by using that yardstick. So in this case, I use the cap. How many caps tall is the bottle? How many caps wide is it, etc. And then from there, use your angles, use your sense of negative space, use plumb lines to help find contours and other features on the subject, like in this case, the label. How does the label fit into the whole thing? How does this plane change occur? How does that look in space? And then slowly build up from there. And once you have the big shapes down, once you have the big proportions, the major forms of your subject on the paper, you might find that it gets easier and easier to figure out exactly where to go next, because now you have context, right? Again, drawing, it's all about relationships. It's very important to have context in your drawing. And when you have more context, more things that you can sort of key off of, it makes it easier to make the next decision and the next decision and the next one. So again, have fun with that. Take your time. This is kind of a tricky thing to learn how to do if you've never done it before. But I promise if you practice it over time, it will get much more intuitive, and it will also help you to be a better observer. So go try it yourself.
So now that we have some forms in place on our page, let's apply what we have learned about shadows. So always begin with the object that's closest to your source of light. So in our case, conveniently located is the cube. So remember that the terminator is the edge. So let's begin by just finding all of the terminator. And after it's in place, just find the outline of the cast shadow. And you have a number of options. You can of course begin to tone this away into a shadow in order to help you see where it is, but I'm just going to establish our terminators here. Now, if you recall, because this is a much more continuous curvature, I spoke to you about placing a terminator with a bit of a tone to begin with in order to establish the particular quality and amplitude of the curvature of a form. As you place these shadows, you can begin to remove some of those construction lines after you place these shadows, you can begin to remove some of those construction lines that we placed in order to better understand our forms. So now we have a little bit of a terminator here. And we don't see any cast shadows. The cast shadow is actually going to be on this part of the cube, but it will combine with the core shadow on the cube, and you do see a little bit of, you see a line for the cast shadow from this entire group of objects on the surface of our table. Now, before we continue, we need to actually find the line for our table and just take it, and here's one of the places where you can actually see it, and take it all the way across. And at this point, I would ignore the actual, the size of our table. So from my view, I see a smaller amount here, and I will just place a few lines to evenly place all the objects on top of our surface. I wouldn't worry too much about where the closest edge of the table is. You can just hint at it for clarity. Okay, so let's move on to the terminator on our sphere. You can take the proportional measurement to see the amount of space it takes up along the perpendicular axis of that terminator. So for this, hold one of the needles up at around the angle of the terminator and place the other at a 90-degree angle, so that you can get a line that's perpendicular to our terminator, which will give you the axis here that we can use to take a proportional measurement. And I had it wrong. It's actually a little more horizontal. And then once that's in place, all you have to do is take an angle and see where it is. But also after placing it, I would take a proportional measurement along that axis, and I'm seeing that it's along that line, just slightly to the left of the halfway point. But as we spoke about earlier, I would almost right away begin placing that terminator with a hatch or a flat area of tone to immediately begin to signify that this is a curved surface. And by doing so, you are anticipating the soft turn out from the terminator into our core shadow and a soft turn out into our dark halftones. And here, let's establish that cast shadow. If you recall, you can't actually connect your terminator on a sphere with the cast shadow on the surface that it's on because of the angle of our light. So because of that angle, the cast shadow is going to be projected onto the surface of the table, because the only tangent with the table the only tangent the sphere has with the table is at a single point at the very bottom. So here we have a situation that's slightly more confusing, and the reason for this is that the only place you actually see a terminator is up top here, because almost the entirety of the nonagon is being hit by a cast shadow from this group of objects. So in this case, it's particularly important to get that line of the cast shadow and see how the angles on it are changing depending on what the surface that they're on. And this will be extremely important because you'll be able to use cast shadows in order to describe the structure of a form. Okay. So now that everything's in place, let's begin with our shading. So once again, we will begin with the closest object. And at the moment, I wouldn't worry about any variations within the shadow. All you need to do is find a flat area of tone that'll be pretty much even all the way across. The whole point here is not to exactly to copy all of the things that are happening on the objects, but to make sure it looks convincing enough. And the only way that'll happen is if we apply our understanding of shadows. So here I'm going to I'm pushing the marks I made into the texture of the paper a little bit to get a smoother tone. See, so I'm working only on the surface of the cube right now. So after we place a tone, you can go back over it. In order to get a more even placement. And then remember that our cast shadows have to be a darker value than our core shadows. Now, in front of us, that's very obvious, but a part of that comes from the fact that the objects are on a black piece of cloth. So the color is affecting the tone. And for our purposes, we're going to ignore this. As long as that is clear, use the eraser to get a sharper edge. Okay, so that's in place currently. Now let's move on to our cylinder. And let's just extend out from that terminator, extend out into our, at first our core shadow, occupying this area on top, and our area of reflected light, which is at the bottom. Now at the moment, as we did before, we don't want too much variation between the two. We just need to start with the tone in place. Kind of integrate it a little more with the paper. And clean up your edges. And then, once that's in place, keep in mind, of course, that this edge here is also a terminator, but a sharp line, a clear sharp line because of the sharpness of the edge. And then here, underneath the cylinder, we're going to have a cast shadow that falls from our cylinder onto the top plane of our cube. So we have an area for the terminator that you can see is a little bit darker than the rest of our shadow, and we could expand on that as we sort of move into and tone down our core shadow a little bit. And you'll see that if you get a tone over the entirety of the area of shadow, and then just and then tone down your core shadow, then this whole area begins to read like reflected light because it's a lighter value. Okay, let's move on to our sphere. So the same thing, I will begin with the core shadow coming off of the terminator. And you can see I'm not doing anything in the halftones at the moment. Except with the hatch, I'm slightly sort of, I'm like, in a sense, I'm planning ahead for the halftones to come, but we're not concerned with them just yet. And all of our shadows are going to be pretty much the same value. Remember that you have to think of your shadows as within, as all within a sort of a singular tonal range in relation to our lights. Integrate it with the paper a little more so that we don't have such clear, obvious marks, and then go back over it. But now you can push the terminator a little bit and the cast shadows that follow. I'm sorry, the core shadow coming off of it. And I'm going to just add a little bit to the general curve of that terminator. And then go back over it. See, in here, in order to get a clear hatch, all you have to do is tilt up the angle of your pencil. And now I'm going to hatch the other way a little bit. Okay, so here's what we have at this point. I'm going to clean up some of these edges, make them a little more obvious, the outer edges of our forms, our geometric solids. And now it's time to place our cast shadow, which is going to be a darker tone in order to lock in our reflected light. And remember that you only really have to push the tone of the shadow as it's right up against the object in order to really lock in that reflected light in between your terminator core shadow and cast shadow. Even here, you might not need to be as dark as you are here at the very base, the of the sphere. And then just extend this outwards. And as you move out, the edges become softer. And I would just, and here, and so because we've understood that this entire part of the nonagon is in a cast shadow, then just continue the cast shadow that you have on the surface of the table into the nonagon without worrying too much about differentiating between the different tonality as the planes change. Just kind of one even tone. So when we were working on these before individually, we were analyzing each individual plane. But right now, we're just thinking of the shadow as a group. So even here, this is our plane of the core shadow. Let's just get a tone that's a nice, flat, even tone, and disregard the variations within the shadow right away. And here, this is all in a cast shadow, so we can just, as long as you can still see your lines, we're good. And then kind of even it out a little bit. Okay. So now it's time to begin to differentiate within the shadows. But keep in mind that this will, of course, keep changing once we get to the halftones. Because if you recall, the more that you add, the more you have to step back and reevaluate the entire tonal situation. Okay, so let's go to the D cylinder, and let's make sure that our terminator and our core shadow read clearly as something separate from our reflected light. So a lot of what we're doing now is based on our understanding of shadows and the practice that we've had with them. And then we're going to have a slightly darker area coming off of this edge also. So our area of reflected light is primarily here. Get that edge. And keep in mind that you can always go back in and make corrections. Now here you have your reflected light, but if you recall on the soccer ball, on the planes that were turned all the way away from our light, turned towards the surface of our table, there was something that I mentioned in brief known as an occlusion shadow, a place where the smallest amount of light hits. And I also said that we're going to ignore it. Now, you do want to use it in some instances, and we are going to work with some of the occlusion shadows. But we're not going to concern ourselves with them at this point in this part of our drawing. Right now, it's important to establish our terminators, our core shadows, and our cast shadows. Okay, so that's beginning to happen. So here is another instance of, here we'll actually have to observe what's happening with our, so actually, speaking of occlusion shadows, we're actually going to have to use a few when we get to that surface of the cube. And you can see that there's a large area of reflected light right here because it's reflecting off of the surface of our sphere. And then as we turn back around our sphere, there isn't as much light being reflected in. So the darkness that you see here in relation to our reflected light here would be part of that occlusion shadow. So we'll go with it. So what you need a lot of the times to get your reflected light to read as reflected light is not to erase out of your shadows to establish that tonal differentiation, but to actually just simply tone down around them. So here we have the darker area coming off of this edge. So we're going to keep the initial tone as our tone of the reflected light. And then here we have our major areas of reflection. And here they are not as strong towards the bottom. You see, so this area is beginning to read like reflected light, and we don't want to overemphasize our reflected lights. It just has to be slightly lighter than the areas around it. And then make sure your cast shadow reads darker. And possibly even a little bit sharper as it nears the terminator. Now, in a sense, you want to keep your terminator the darkest point because it's also the closest point. And I'm going to just go over this. And as we go, you might want to get a little bit of clarity on the sphere itself, using the shadows around it to get a clear, clean edge. Here we have an area of reflected light that's also coming off of the surface of our sphere. So we're going to get that to work by making the area around it darker. Get a clean, sharp edge to it, either with a line or by erasing a nice, clear, clean edge. So as you see, we are sort of taking relative values. We're not transferring the exact values that we see in front of us. The idea here is to be in control of our light, and not the other way around. Here, even for the purpose of effect, and that's sort of happening, we can tone down this shadow to bring up closer to us this edge of the ellipse, of the open surface of the cylinder that we see. Here, and here, once again, I'm just going to sort of work off of that edge, our terminator, and this right now is clearly reading like a reflected light, and yet it's still part of our shadows. Now, I am not aware if we're going to have to go back into this and tone down our reflected light once we place our halftones, but that is a possibility and happens more often than not. But we'll get there. Okay, so here we have a little more clarity and a little more variation within the shadows in our cube and our cylinder. Let's move on and do a little bit more of that with our sphere. And we'll, as always begin working from your terminators and establish that soft gradation into your core shadow and reflected light. And then simply by comparing to the reflected light that we already have established in our other objects, I have a feeling that what we have on the sphere is going to be a little too light. And also, you have to keep thinking about which object is closest to you and emphasizing that. So even if we don't really see, though I would say that's there, that the terminator on the sphere is a darker value than this edge, it makes sense to push that tonal difference just a bit, just to make it appear a little closer, just to emphasize it a little more. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that sort of emphasis of objects and parts of objects that are closer to us as the viewer and those that are farther away during the entire course. So what we need, so here we have a little bit of that occlusion I was talking about, so we're not going to worry about it too much here. But what we need more than anything else is to make it clear that what we have right here is our cast shadow, and it's a darker value. And what we have right here is our reflected light. Because of the occlusion, it's not going to be as bright as, say, some of the reflected light that we have here. So we need to start worrying about that right now. And then here you can see that there's this entire area of reflected light, and essentially we're just going to need to show it as much as possible with our core shadow and the cast shadow behind it. So we can extend our core shadow. It's obviously already catching a little more reflected light, and so it's not going to be as dark as the immediate core shadows coming off of our Terminator. And always keep stepping away to kind of view all the relationships at once. And then get back to it. And now we're gonna need some of the tones around this just to push that cast shadow a little bit. And as you see, we're beginning to pull out, without actually working on them, our reflected lights. Just gotta clean this up a little bit. Okay. I feel like our Terminator needs one more pass.